Did you know that some medieval farmers used geese as burglar alarms? Or that for centuries the wealth of a forest wasn't measured in timber, but in how many pigs it could fatten? We look at the Middle Ages as a time of dirt, disease, and toil. And it was, but it was also a time of incredible ingenuity. Farmers didn't have antibiotics, factories, or GPS-guided tractors. They had their hands, their wits, and a deep, almost forgotten connection to the land and their animals. They had to be clever. Their survival depended on it. What if their solutions, born from necessity, hold lessons we've completely forgotten? What if the secret to a more resilient way of farming is buried in the past, hidden in plain sight in old manuscripts and overgrown landscapes? They were working with closed-loop systems not because it was trendy, but because there was no other choice. Every scrap of dung, every fallen leaf, every bit of an animal had a purpose. Well, it had to. We've replaced that intricate knowledge with brute force and chemicals. But did we lose something vital in the trade? Let's look back at some of the things they did. Not to romanticize the past, but to understand what we might have left behind. Number 17, what if your fence was also your animal feed? Today, we think of fences as barriers. They are made of wire, wood, or metal. Their job is to keep animals in or out. It's a simple, one-dimensional purpose. But what if your fence did more? What if it was also a living pantry for your livestock? This is the idea behind the forgotten art of the living fodder fence. It wasn't just a fence, it was a critical piece of the farm's ecosystem. The practice involved creating hedgerows, but not the manicured, ornamental ones we see today. These were thick, complex barriers made of specific trees and shrubs. Farmers would plant species like hawthorn, blackthorn, hazel, and field maple. These were chosen for their dense, thorny growth, which made them stock-proof. But they were also chosen for what they produced. The real genius was in how they managed these living walls. They used techniques like pollarding and coppicing. Coppicing is when you cut a tree down to its stump. The stump then sends up multiple new shoots, which grow straight and fast. Pollarding is similar, but you cut the tree higher up, above the reach of browsing animals like deer or cattle. Why do this? Because the young, new growth from these trees is surprisingly nutritious. The leaves and tender twigs are a valuable source of food for livestock, especially during late summer or in a drought when grass is scarce. This material is often called tree hay or leaf fodder. Farmers would harvest these branches and feed them directly to their animals. It was a way to supplement their diet with minerals and nutrients not always available in pasture. The Roman writer Columella mentioned the practice of feeding elm leaves to cattle in his work, De Re Rustica, back in the 1st century AD, so this knowledge is ancient. By the medieval period, it was a standard part of animal husbandry in many parts of Europe. Research from modern agroforestry studies confirms the wisdom of this. For example, a study published in the journal Animal Feed Science and Technology has shown that the leaves of trees like willow and poplar have protein levels comparable to alfalfa. They are also rich in minerals like zinc and cobalt. Medieval farmers didn't have labs to test for crude protein content. They knew it worked because they saw their animals thrive. They saw that the sheep with access to tree fodder were healthier and produced better wool. The hedgerow was a multi-purpose tool. It was a barrier. It was a food source. It was also a habitat for beneficial insects that would pollinate crops. It provided wood for fuel and tools. The system was incredibly efficient. The labor of maintaining the fence also produced food. Nothing was wasted. Compare that to a modern wire fence. It costs money to buy. It takes labor to install. It slowly rusts and needs to be replaced. Its only function is to be a barrier. It gives nothing back to the farm's ecosystem. The medieval living fence was an active, productive part of the farm. It was a symbiotic relationship. We have largely forgotten this. We see hedges as landscape features, not as productive agricultural systems. We spend money on imported high-protein feeds while letting a potential food source on our field edges go unmanaged. The knowledge of which trees are safe, which are most palatable, and when to harvest them has faded into obscurity. It required an intimate understanding of the local environment, a skill passed down through generations. But it leaves us with some unsettling questions. How many native tree species in our own backyards hold untapped nutritional value for livestock that we've never even considered? Do different tree hays produce different flavors in milk or meat, creating a kind of medieval terroir we can no longer taste? And in an age of climate change and increasingly frequent droughts, have we completely overlooked the most resilient and sustainable source of animal feed right in front of us, the trees? Number 16, could geese really replace a guard dog? We think of geese as aggressive, noisy park birds. They hiss and chase people. Most of us see them as a nuisance, but in the medieval world, that exact behavior was a highly valued security feature. A flock of geese was one of the most effective and affordable alarm systems you could have. They were the farm's early warning system. Think about how a goose behaves. It is fiercely territorial, it has excellent eyesight and hearing, it is naturally wary of strangers and predators, and most importantly, when it perceives a threat, it makes an incredible amount of noise. A flock of geese all honking at once is impossible to ignore. Unlike a dog, you can't easily silence a goose with a piece of meat. They are suspicious of everything unfamiliar. A fox, a thief, or a wolf trying to sneak onto the farm at night would be met with a cacophony of alarm calls. This would wake the farmer and his family, giving them time to react. This wasn't just a folk practice, it has historical weight. The ancient Romans famously credited the sacred geese of the Temple of Juno with saving the city. In 390 BC, during a siege, Gauls tried to scale the walls of the Capitoline Hill at night. The dogs didn't bark, but the geese cackled and flapped their wings, waking the Roman guards and saving the citadel. The historian Livy recorded the event, cementing the goose's reputation as a vigilant guardian. This reputation carried right through the Middle Ages. For a small-scale farmer or a monastery, a flock of geese was a perfect security solution. They were cheaper than keeping and training several large dogs, and they did more than just stand guard. They were a multi-purpose asset, which was the cornerstone of medieval thinking. Your alarm system also provided you with food. Geese produce large, rich eggs. They are excellent foragers, converting grass and weeds into meat with very little input from the farmer. At the end of their useful life as sentinels, they provided a feast for the table, especially around Michaelmas in late September. Their feathers and down were incredibly valuable for stuffing pillows, mattresses, and for fletching arrows. A single animal served 4 or 5 distinct purposes: security, eggs, meat, and feathers. It's a level of efficiency that is hard to match with modern single-purpose technologies. And modern studies have even looked into this. There are accounts of police departments in places like Xinjiang, China, using geese to guard police stations because they are considered more reliable and aggressive than dogs in some situations. Poultry scientists note that their wide field of vision, almost 360 degrees, makes them difficult to sneak up on. Their flocking instinct means that if one is alarmed, they all are. It's a distributed, decentralized alarm network. So why do we forget this? As farms grew larger and more specialized, the role of the goose as a guardian diminished. We developed technologies like electric fences and security cameras. We started keeping dogs purely as pets or specialized guard animals, rather than as part of a broader farm ecosystem. The idea of an animal having multiple jobs became less common. We value specialization over versatility. The goose became just a bird for the table, its other skills ignored and eventually forgotten. We bred them for bigger breasts and faster growth, not for vigilance. This leaves us wondering, in our modern quest for high-tech security, did we overlook a simple, low-cost biological solution that has been proven for millennia? How many other animals have natural behaviors that we dismiss as a nuisance, but which could be harnessed for a specific useful purpose? And could the very act of reintegrating multi-purpose animals like guard geese force us to create more resilient, less fragmented farm systems? Number 15, why would you build a house for pigeons? If you see pigeons today, you probably think of them as pests. They're city birds, rats with wings. But for centuries, the pigeon, or more specifically the rock dove, was one of the most prized animals on a medieval estate. They were so important that people built special houses for them. These structures were called dovecotes or culver houses. They were often large, impressive stone towers, a sign of wealth and status. Only the lord of the manor or a monastery typically had the right to build one. Why all the fuss for pigeons? 2 reasons: meat and manure. First, the meat. Pigeons reproduce incredibly quickly. A single pair can produce up to a dozen offspring, called squabs, in a year. These young birds were harvested just before they were ready to fly, when they were still plump and tender. Squab was a delicacy. It was a reliable source of fresh meat available throughout the year, especially during the winter when other livestock had been slaughtered and salted down. For a noble household, having a steady supply of fresh roast squab was a luxury that set them apart. The scale of this was huge. A large dovecote, like the 13th century one at Athelhampton Hall in Dorset, England, could house over 500 pairs of pigeons, producing thousands of birds for the table each year. The second reason was even more important for the farm's productivity than manure. Pigeon droppings, or guano, are an incredibly potent fertilizer. It is extremely high in nitrogen and phosphorus. In an age before chemical fertilizers, this was liquid gold. Farmers would collect the dung that accumulated on the floor of the dovecote. They used it to fertilize their most valuable crops, like those in the kitchen garden or vineyards. The value of the manure was so high that it was sometimes used as part of a bride's dowry. Historical records show that dovecote manure was considered far more powerful than that of sheep or cattle. A small amount could dramatically increase crop yields. This closed the loop on the system. The pigeons would fly out and forage for food in the surrounding fields, effectively collecting nutrients from a wide area and concentrating them in one spot for the farmer to use. The design of the dovecotes was a specialized form of architecture. They were built to protect the birds from predators like weasels and rats, often with smooth walls and a single high entrance. Inside, the walls were lined from floor to ceiling with hundreds of nesting boxes, or alcoves, for the birds. A central rotating ladder, called a potence, allowed someone to climb up and access all the nests to collect the squabs and eggs. It was a highly efficient system for vertical farming. The decline of the dovecote came with agricultural changes. The introduction of new winter feed crops like turnips and clover from the 17th century onwards meant that farmers could keep more livestock alive through the winter. Fresh meat was no longer such a rare luxury. At the same time, there was growing resentment from common farmers. The Lord's pigeons would feed on their newly sown crops, and they were forbidden from harming the birds. The dovecote became a symbol of feudal privilege and oppression. As the old manorial system broke down, so did the tradition of keeping dovecotes. Eventually, the knowledge of their value was lost, and pigeons reverted to being seen as a nuisance. But think about what we lost. We lost a system that produced high-quality protein and potent organic fertilizer with minimal input. The birds fed themselves. Today, we produce nitrogen fertilizer using the Haber-Bosch process, an industrial method that consumes vast amounts of fossil fuels. The medieval dovecote did the same job, powered by the natural foraging behavior of birds. It makes you wonder, could modern, small-scale versions of dovecotes be a viable way to produce sustainable fertilizer and food for urban or small farm settings? Did we discard the entire concept just because of its association with a feudal class system? And what other pest animals possess a hidden agricultural value that we are currently too blind to see? In number 14, what if the key to healthy animals was bitter tree bark? When a modern farm animal gets sick, we call a vet. The solution is often an injection of antibiotics or some other powerful pharmaceutical. In the Middle Ages, they didn't have this option. Veterinary medicine as we know it did not exist. Instead, they relied on a deep well of traditional knowledge, a kind of folk medicine for animals. Much of this revolved around the use of herbs and plants, and while some of their practices were based on superstition, others were surprisingly effective. One of the most important but forgotten areas was the use of natural dewormers, or anthelmintics. Internal parasites are a huge problem for livestock. Worms can cause weight loss, sickness, and even death. Medieval farmers knew this. They saw the effects, even if they didn't understand the life cycle of a nematode. Their solution was to use plants that had deworming properties. They would either add these plants to the animals' feed or, more cleverly, ensure the animals had access to them in their pasture or woodland. The animals would often self-medicate, instinctively eating plants that helped them fight off parasites. Many of these plants were things we now consider weeds or just trees. For example, the bark of the willow tree contains salicin, which is the natural precursor to aspirin. It's an anti-inflammatory and pain reliever. But other compounds in trees like willow, alder, and ash were known to help with internal parasites. These plants are rich in tannins. For a long time, tannins were considered an anti-nutritional factor in modern agriculture because they can reduce protein absorption. But recent research is showing that in moderation, tannins have a powerful anthelmintic effect. A 2005 study in the journal Veterinary Parasitology showed that feeding tannin-rich forage like bird's foot trefoil to sheep significantly reduced their intestinal worm burden. The medieval farmer who let his sheep browse on tree leaves and shrubs was unknowingly providing them with a natural medicine cabinet. Another key plant was wormwood Artemisia absinthium. The name itself tells you its use. This bitter herb contains compounds like thujoni that are toxic to intestinal worms. Farmers would grow it and feed small amounts to their pigs and other livestock to help keep them clear of parasites. The knowledge was incredibly specific. They knew how much to use, as too much could be harmful. They knew which plants worked for which ailments. This was not random guessing. It was a body of knowledge built over centuries of careful observation. The 12th century abbess Hildegard of Bingen wrote extensively on the healing properties of plants for both humans and animals, documenting a system of medicine that was deeply intertwined with the natural world. So, what happened to this knowledge? The rise of modern veterinary science in the 19th and 20th centuries brought powerful synthetic drugs. A single dose of a chemical dewormer was far more effective and convenient than managing pastures for medicinal plants. The old ways were seen as unscientific and inefficient. Farmers were told to clear their pastures of weeds and plant monocultures of high-yield ryegrass. In doing so, they stripped the land of its natural pharmacy. The result is that we are now completely dependent on a small number of chemical dewormers, and parasites are rapidly developing resistance to them. We are approaching a crisis where our wonder drugs may stop working. This forces us to ask some difficult questions. In our drive for clinical efficiency, have we made our animals more fragile and dependent on a failing chemical crutch? Did the biodiversity of old medieval pastures provide a kind of herd immunity to parasites that our sterile monocultures lack? And how many cures for modern agricultural diseases are still growing out there, dismissed as weeds, waiting for us to rediscover the knowledge our ancestors took for granted? Number 13, could you run a farm without buying salt? The salt is essential for life. Humans and animals both need it for basic bodily functions. Today, we get it easily. We buy salt licks for our cattle, blocks of mineralized salt that we leave in the pasture. For a medieval peasant, however, salt was an expensive commodity. It was heavily taxed and often controlled by the wealthy. Transporting it inland from coastal salt pans was difficult. A self-sufficient farm had to be creative. They needed a way to provide this essential nutrient to their livestock without relying on a costly supply chain. One forgotten technique was the creation and use of turf ash. The process was simple but ingenious. Farmers would go to areas with salt marshes or coastal pastures that were regularly inundated by the tide. They would cut the turf, the top layer of soil with all the grass and roots, into bricks. These bricks were then dried and, most importantly, slowly burned. As the turf smoldered, the organic matter would burn away, but the salt that had been absorbed by the plants and soil from the seawater would be left behind. The result was a salty, mineral-rich ash. This ash was then used in several ways. It could be mixed with the animal's regular fodder, or it could be left in a trough for the animals to lick at will, a kind of primitive salt lick. The animals would instinctively consume as much as they needed. This wasn't pure sodium chloride like our modern salt licks. It was a complex mix of minerals. It contained not just salt, but also potassium, calcium, and a host of trace elements that were present in the seaside ecosystem. It was a complete mineral supplement perfectly tailored to the local environment. This practice is documented in historical agricultural texts and archaeological findings. For example, analysis of soil from medieval farm sites in coastal regions of England and the Netherlands shows evidence of these burning activities. The Annales Cambriae, a set of Welsh chronicles, mentions the importance of salt marshes for grazing animals, hinting at the value placed on these unique environments. It was a low-tech, labor-intensive, but highly effective way of harnessing a natural resource. It turned a muddy, unplowable piece of land into a source of a vital nutrient. The practice died out for obvious reasons. As transportation improved and industrial-scale salt production made salt cheaper and more widely available, there was no longer any need to spend days cutting, drying, and burning turf. It was easier to just buy a bag of salt. The knowledge of how to do it, which areas produced the best ash, and the right way to burn the turf without getting it too hot all faded away. We opted for convenience over self-sufficiency, but the loss of this technique represents more than just a change in technology. It represents a change in mindset. The medieval farmer saw the landscape as a collection of resources to be cleverly unlocked. The modern farmer often sees it as a blank slate upon which to impose an industrial model. We buy our inputs, fertilizer, feed, and minerals from a global supply chain. This makes us efficient but also vulnerable. a disruption in that supply chain, a rise in fuel prices, and the whole system can be threatened. The turf ash method was completely local and resilient. It depended only on labor and local resources. It makes you think, are there other simple, low-tech ways of harvesting essential minerals from our local environments that we've completely forgotten? By giving our animals purified single-ingredient supplements like sodium chloride, are we depriving them of the complex mix of trace minerals that a natural source like turf ash would provide? And what is the true cost of convenience when it erodes our resilience and our connection to the land under our feet? Number 12, why were pigs so important in the forest? When we think of a pig farm today, we picture a barn. We see pigs in concrete pens, eating processed feed from a trough. The forest is the last place we would expect to see a pig. But for most of the Middle Ages, the forest was the pig's natural habitat, and the practice of sending pigs into the woods to forage was a cornerstone of the medieval economy. It was called pannage, or common of mast. The system was centered on the autumn. After the harvest, from roughly the end of September to the end of November, swineherds would drive their village's pigs into the local oak and beech forests. The pig's job was to eat the fallen acorns, beechnuts, and chestnuts. This mast was an incredibly rich source of fat and protein. It was the perfect food for fattening pigs, up quickly before the winter slaughter. A pig could gain a significant amount of weight in just a few weeks of pannage. This was free food, it required no cultivation, no harvesting by human hands, and no storage. The pigs did all the work. This wasn't just a casual activity, it was a highly regulated system. The Domesday Book of 1086, a massive survey of England commissioned by William the Conqueror, frequently measured the value of a woodland not by its acreage or the amount of timber it held, but by the number of pigs it could support for pannage. A wood for 100 pigs was a standard unit of measurement. The lord of the manor would charge a fee for the right to graze pigs in his woods, often taking 1 out of every 10 pigs as payment. This shows how economically vital the practice was. Pannage was good for the pigs, good for the people, and good for the forest. The pigs got fattened on high-quality food, which resulted in flavorful, prized pork and lard. People got a supply of meat to see them through the winter. The forest also benefited. Acorns are toxic to cattle and horses if eaten in large quantities, so the pigs were performing a valuable service by clearing them from the forest floor. They also rooted around in the soil, which helped to aerate it and prepare the ground for new seeds to germinate. They were an integrated part of the woodland ecosystem, so why did we stop doing this? The decline of pannage was a slow process. As populations grew, there was more pressure on woodlands. Forests were cleared for agriculture. The great oak woods that once covered Europe began to shrink. There was also a push towards more efficient and controllable forms of agriculture. It was easier to keep your pigs in a sty where you could control their diet and breeding, rather than letting them roam semi-wild in a forest. New feed crops like potatoes and corn provided a cheaper and more reliable way to fatten pigs. The old system, which required skilled swineherds and access to large areas of common woodland, gradually fell apart. Today, the practice is almost entirely gone, surviving only in a few specific places like the New Forest in England or in parts of Spain where Iberian pigs are raised to produce high-end jamón ibérico de bellota. We have traded a system that produced unique, high-quality meat using a free natural resource for an industrial system that relies on resource-intensive grain production. The modern pig is a machine for converting corn and soy into pork, completely divorced from its natural environment. This loss raises profound questions. What unique nutritional qualities and flavors have we lost from our pork by removing the pig from the forest? Could the practice of pannage be revived as a way to manage modern forests, reduce fire risk by clearing the understory, and produce a high-value, sustainable meat product? And what does it say about our relationship with nature that we took an animal perfectly adapted to thrive in a woodland ecosystem and locked it inside a concrete box? Number 11. Did they really shear sheep? Twice a year. The modern sheep industry has a simple calendar. You shear a sheep once a year, usually in the spring after the worst of the cold is over, and before the heat of summer sets in. You take the entire fleece off in one go. It's an efficient, standardized process. But it wasn't always this way. There is evidence that in the medieval period, some farmers practiced a two-part shearing system, a technique that is now almost completely forgotten. The main shearing was in the spring, But there was a second, more unusual event, the rubbing of the neck wool in the autumn. This wasn't a full shearing. The farmer would carefully pluck or shear just the wool from the sheep's neck and shoulders. This wool is often the finest and softest on the entire animal. Why would they do this? It seems like a lot of extra work right before winter, when the sheep needs its fleece the most. The logic was twofold. First, it was about fiber quality. By taking this prime wool separately, they could keep it from getting mixed with the coarser wool from the rest of the body. This high-quality neck wool could be sold for a higher price or used by the family to spin into fine yarn for their best clothes. It was a way of sorting the product at the source. The second reason was about the health of the sheep. The thick wool around the neck and shoulders can get very heavy, especially when it gets wet and matted with mud and burrs during the autumn and winter. This could weigh the sheep's head down and make it more difficult for it to graze. It also created a damp, warm environment that was a perfect breeding ground for parasites like lice and scab mites. By removing this wool before the wettest part of the year, the farmer was preemptively cleaning the sheep and reducing its parasite load. It was a form of preventative medicine. They were trading a small amount of insulation for a big gain in health and comfort for the animal. This practice is mentioned in older agricultural texts such as Walter of Henley's Husbandry, a 13th century guide to managing an estate. He advises on the timing of shearing and the care of sheep, and his writings suggest a much more hands-on, observant approach to flock management than we often see today. The farmer knew each animal. They understood the nuances of wool growth and animal health. This wasn't factory farming, it was careful stockmanship. Why did this practice disappear? As with so many other things, it was a victim of scale and the drive for efficiency. As flocks got larger, it was no longer practical for a shepherd to handle each sheep twice a year for a partial shearing. The development of chemical dips and treatments for parasites provided an easier, though less elegant, solution to the problem of winter pests. The wool market also changed. The Industrial Revolution created machines that could process all types of wool, and the demand shifted towards quantity over the subtle differences in quality that the medieval farmers so carefully preserved. It became easier and more profitable to shear the whole sheep once and sell the fleece as a single commodity. But the loss of this technique makes you wonder, by treating the entire fleece as one uniform product, what value are we losing in terms of fiber quality and specialized use? Are our modern one-size-fits-all parasite treatments ultimately less effective and more damaging than the old preventative methods that were based on simple physical intervention? And does the forgotten art of the autumn roving point to a more intimate and observant relationship between the shepherd and the flock, a relationship that has been lost in the age of industrial-scale agriculture? Number 10, how did they move thousands of animals without trucks? We move livestock today in big metal trucks and trailers. It's fast, efficient, and relies entirely on fossil fuels and a network of paved roads. Before the engine, there was a different kind of highway system, a network of green roads and ancient tracks used for moving animals on foot. This practice of moving herds over long distances was called droving, and it was the circulatory system of the medieval livestock economy. Transhumance is the seasonal movement of animals between summer and winter pastures. In many parts of Europe, this meant moving sheep and cattle from lowland farms up into high mountain pastures for the summer. In other areas like England and Wales, it involved drovers walking huge herds of cattle or flocks of sheep for hundreds of miles from the places where they were raised, like the Welsh Hills or the Scottish Highlands, to the booming markets of London. These journeys could take weeks. The drovers were skilled professionals who lived a nomadic life on the road. The drove roads were not like our modern roads. They were wide, grassy tracks, often running along high ground to avoid the wet, muddy valleys. They were designed to provide grazing for the animals as they walked. Along the way, there was a whole infrastructure to support the trade. There were designated stopping points, often large fields that could be rented for the night to rest and graze the animals. There were inns that catered specifically to the drovers. The entire system was designed around the pace of a walking cow. The drovers had to be expert stockmen, able to keep the animals healthy and moving without losing too much weight. They were also often bankers carrying large sums of money from the sale of the cattle, which led to the formation of some of the first rural banks. The scale of this was immense. It's estimated that in the 17th and 18th centuries, over 100,000 cattle were walked from Scotland to England each year. This was a slow, steady river of livestock flowing across the country. It connected the remote breeding areas with the dense population centers. It was a system that worked for centuries, powered only by grass and the skill of the drovers and their dogs. The animals arrived at their destination fit and healthy, having walked there gradually. The end of the droving era came swiftly with the arrival of the railways in the 19th century. A journey that took a drover 3 weeks could be done by train in a single day. The old drove roads fell into disuse, many were paved over or plowed up, and today they exist only as forgotten footpaths or bridleways. The skills of the drover, the knowledge of the routes, the special breeds of hardy cattle that could withstand the long walk, all of it faded away. We replaced a solar-powered sustainable system of transport with one that was faster but entirely dependent on extracted resources. The loss of droving leaves us with some big questions. In an era of high fuel costs and concerns about the carbon footprint of our food, have we overlooked the potential of moving animals on the hoof, even for shorter distances? What did the slow, gradual journey do for the quality of the meat compared to the stress of modern truck transport? And as we look at our fragmented landscape, could reopening these ancient green corridors, not only for livestock but for wildlife, be a way to reconnect our ecosystems and our own history? Number 9, what if manure was more valuable than gold? So, in our modern world, animal manure is a problem. It's a waste product. A large dairy farm or a feedlot produces mountains of it. It can pollute waterways and create a disposal nightmare. We have broken the nutrient cycle. We grow crops in one place using chemical fertilizers and raise animals in another, creating a surplus of manure. In the medieval world, manure was not a waste product. It was arguably the most valuable thing on the farm. It was the engine of fertility. It was wealth. The medieval farmer understood a simple truth: if you take from the soil, you must give back. Every harvest of grain or hay removed nutrients from the field. Without a way to replenish them, the soil would quickly become exhausted and crop yields would plummet. They didn't have access to bags of NPK fertilizer. Their only source of fertility was organic matter, and the most concentrated form of that was animal manure. The entire farm system was often designed around the production, collection, and strategic use of dung. One key technique was known as folding or tathing. This involved penning sheep or cattle in a temporary enclosure, called a fold, on a field that was due to be plowed for crops. The animals would be kept there overnight for a period of time. As they rested, they would deposit their dung and urine directly onto the soil where it was needed most. The next night, the fold would be moved to an adjacent patch of ground. Over several weeks, the entire field would be systematically fertilized. This was a brilliant way to transfer fertility from the pasture, where the animals grazed during the day, to the arable fields. Texts like the 11th century Geoponica, a Byzantine agricultural manual, detail the different qualities of manure from various animals, noting that a pigeon's was the most powerful, followed by a pig's. The value of manure was so high that it was a source of legal disputes. Manorial records are full of cases where tenants were fined for not properly collecting the dung from their animals or for trying to sell it off the manor. The right to collect dung from the common lands was a jealously guarded privilege. They used every scrap. They would collect clat from the pasture, dried cakes of cow dung, which could be used as fuel for the fire in areas where wood was scarce. So they would mix manure with clay and straw to make building materials. Nothing was wasted. The shift away from this mindset began with the discovery of guano deposits in South America in the 19th century and was cemented by the invention of the Haber-Bosch process for creating synthetic nitrogen fertilizer in the early 20th century. Suddenly, fertility was something you could buy in a bag. It was cheap, easy to apply, and incredibly effective. Farmers no longer needed to base their entire operation around the careful management of manure. They could specialize. You could have a farm with no animals at all and still grow crops. The nutrient cycle was broken, and manure became a problem instead of a solution. This history forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths. Has our reliance on chemical fertilizers created a fragile system that is completely dependent on fossil fuels and vulnerable to price shocks? By treating manure as waste, are we throwing away the very resource we need to build healthy, carbon-rich soils and fight climate change? And could a return to mixed farming, where animals are reintegrated into the crop-growing process, be the only truly sustainable way to feed ourselves in the long term? Number 8, how did they keep animals healthy without a vet? The health of an animal in the Middle Ages was a precarious thing. A simple infection or a difficult birth could easily be a death sentence. Without antibiotics, surgical tools, or a scientific understanding of disease, The medieval farmer had to be a jack of all trades. They were part herbalist, part observer, and part pragmatist. Their approach to animal health was based on a principle we are only just beginning to appreciate again: prevention is better than cure. One of the most important forgotten tricks was not a specific medicine, but a system of management multi-species grazing. It's common today to see a field full of only one type of animal, be it cattle or sheep. This is specialization. The medieval farmer often grazed different species together or in rotation on the same pasture. A flock of sheep might be followed by a herd of cattle, which might then be followed by geese. This wasn't just a random mixing, there was a deep ecological logic to it. Different animals have different grazing habits. The cattle use their tongues to pull up taller grasses. Sheep graze much closer to the ground, eating the shorter grasses and forbs that the cattle leave behind. Goats are browsers, preferring shrubs and weeds that both cattle and sheep might ignore. By grazing them together, the farmer got a much more even and complete use of the pasture. The geese would come in and pick at the short clover and clean up spilled grain. This maximized the amount of food harvested from a single piece of land. But the real genius of the system was in how it controlled parasites. Most internal parasites are host-specific. The worms that infect sheep generally do not infect cattle, and vice versa. When sheep graze a pasture, they shed parasite eggs in their manure. If more sheep follow them, those eggs will hatch and reinfect the new sheep, leading to a massive buildup of parasites in the pasture. But if you follow the sheep with cattle, the cattle act as a biological vacuum cleaner. They ingest the sheepworm larvae, but since they're not the correct host, the larvae die in the cow's digestive system. The life cycle of the parasite is broken. The pasture is effectively cleaned for the next time the sheep come through. This is a concept that modern parasitologists have confirmed. Studies, like those published by the agricultural research organization ATRA, show that rotational grazing with mixed species can dramatically reduce the need for chemical dewormers. The medieval farmer didn't know about the life cycle of the stomach worm, but they knew through generations of observation that this system led to healthier animals. It was a cheap, simple, and incredibly effective form of preventative medicine that was built into the very structure of their farming. So, why did we forget it? The drive for specialization and scale made it seem inefficient. It's easier to manage a herd of 100 dairy cows if you don't also have to worry about a flock of sheep and a gaggle of geese. Fences, feeding systems, and milking parlors were all designed for a single species. We developed powerful chemical dewormers that made it possible to keep large numbers of the same animal together on the same ground without them all dying of parasites. We replaced ecological complexity with chemical simplicity, but now, as those chemicals are failing due to parasite resistance, we are being forced to look back at the wisdom of the old ways. This leads to some critical questions. How many other symbiotic relationships between different species did medieval farmers understand and utilize that we have completely lost? By creating vast monocultures of both plants and animals, have we inadvertently created the perfect breeding grounds for pests and diseases? And is the future of sustainable farming not about finding a new silver bullet chemical, but about rediscovering the complex integrated systems that our ancestors perfected over centuries? Number 7. Could you work a field with an ox? The image of the medieval farmer is often of a man behind a plow pulled by a horse. But for much of the Middle Ages, the horse was a luxury item. It was the animal of war, of transport for the rich, and of speed. The real workhorse of the medieval farm was not a horse at all. It was the ox. An ox is simply a mature, castrated male bovine that has been trained for draft work. For centuries, they were the primary source of traction power for plowing, hauling carts, and turning mills. Why would you choose an ox over a horse? A horse is faster, but an ox has several huge advantages that made it the perfect choice for a medieval peasant. First, they are incredibly strong and have tremendous stamina. Their slow, steady pace is perfectly suited to the heavy work of pulling a plow through dense clay soil. They can pull for longer without tiring than a horse can. Second, they were much cheaper to acquire and keep. A young bullock could be raised on the farm, while a good draft horse often had to be purchased. The real economic advantage came down to what they ate and what they wore. An ox can be fed almost entirely on grass and hay, the same food as the rest of the cattle herd. A horse doing heavy work needs expensive grain, like oats, to keep it in condition. That was grain that the farmer's family could have eaten themselves. Then there was the issue of shoes. Horses require individually fitted iron horseshoes, which had to be made and fitted by a skilled and expensive blacksmith. Few oxen could work barefoot on soft ground, or they could be fitted with simple two-part iron shoes called cues, which were cheaper and easier to make. Finally, there was the end-of-life value. When a horse got too old to work, it was worth very little. Its meat was not highly prized, but when an ox reached the end of its working life, it could be fattened up for a few months and then slaughtered. It provided a large quantity of beef for the family or to be sold at market. Your tractor, at the end of its life, was also your dinner. This was a critical part of the closed-loop economy of the medieval farm. The technology of harnessing them was also different. Horses used a horse collar, a brilliant invention that allowed them to pull with their shoulders. Oxen used a yoke, a heavy wooden beam that rested across their necks and shoulders. The design of these yokes was refined over centuries to maximize the animal's pulling power and comfort. And archaeological finds across Europe have unearthed different styles of yokes, showing a sophisticated understanding of animal anatomy and physics. The shift from oxen to horses for farm work happened gradually, beginning in the later Middle Ages. The invention of the improved horse collar was a key factor. As agriculture became more commercialized and speed became more important, the faster horse began to win out. By the 18th century, the ox had been largely relegated to poorer, more remote areas. The tractor finished the job in the 20th century, and the art of training and working with oxen was almost entirely lost. But looking back, we have to ask some questions. Was the slow, steady pace of the ox a better match for the health of the soil than the speed of the horse or the weight of a modern tractor, which can cause soil compaction? In a world of volatile energy prices, does the idea of a self-replicating, grass-powered tractor that you can also eat hold a certain appeal? And what have we lost in terms of the human-animal bond, that deep, quiet partnership that existed between a farmer and his team of oxen who worked together day after day, year after year? Number 6. What if winter feed grew on trees? When winter came to the medieval farm, it brought a period of scarcity known as the Hungry Gap. The grass stopped growing, stored hay was the main source of food for livestock, and it often ran out before spring arrived. Farmers had to make a brutal calculation which animals were essential to keep alive until spring, and which had to be slaughtered. This annual cull was a fact of life, but clever farmers had a supplemental feed source that we have almost completely forgotten: tree hay. Tree hay, or leaf fodder, is exactly what it sounds like. It's animal feed made from the leafy branches of trees. Throughout the summer, farmers would cut branches from specific trees, bundle them together, and dry them for storage. They were effectively making hay from trees. This was a critical source of winter feed, full of nutrients that were often lacking in dry grass hay. It was a way to store summer's solar energy in a stable form to get through the winter. Not all trees were suitable. Farmers had a deep practical knowledge of which species were best. Elm and ash were particularly prized. Their leaves are highly palatable and nutritious for cattle and sheep. Other trees like linden lime, poplar, and willow were also used. The process was part of a sustainable forestry system. The farmers didn't just chop down the trees, they used the techniques of pollarding and coppicing. By cutting the trees in a regular cycle, they ensured a steady supply of new leafy growth year after year. A pollarded elm could be harvested for fodder for hundreds of years. It was a living, regenerating resource. The historical evidence for this is widespread. Oliver Rackham, a renowned English historical ecologist, found extensive evidence in manorial records and by studying ancient trees themselves. The Domesday Book mentions silvopastile, which translates as wood pasture, indicating woodlands that were managed not for timber but for grazing and fodder. In Scandinavia, the practice was even more ingrained. There, farmers built special leaf fodder barns, and the right to harvest leaves from certain trees was a legally defined part of a farm's assets. The nutritional science backs this up. A 2012 study published in Agroforestry Systems analyzed the composition of various tree fodders and found that many, like ash, had crude protein levels as high as 16%, which is comparable to high-quality legume hay like alfalfa. They are also rich in minerals that the tree's deep roots pull up from the subsoil, minerals that might not be available in the shallow-rooted pasture grasses. It was a well-rounded diet, so why on earth did we stop doing this? The agricultural revolution of the 18th century introduced new fodder crops like turnips and clover. These crops could be grown in fields and produced a large amount of winter feed. They were more suited to the new open field system of farming. The old wood pastures were seen as inefficient. Many were cleared to make way for more productive farmland. The labor-intensive process of harvesting and drying tree hay couldn't compete with the ease of growing a field of turnips. The knowledge simply fell out of use. But now, facing climate change, the idea of tree hay is getting a second look. Trees are far more drought resistant than pasture grasses. Their deep roots can access water that shallow rooted plants can't. In a dry summer, when the pastures are brown and barren, the trees are still green. They represent a resilient, stable source of feed. This makes us wonder, have we made our livestock systems incredibly vulnerable by relying almost exclusively on fragile grasslands? Could reintroducing tree hay and silvopasture systems be a key strategy for adapting our farms to a more unpredictable climate? And how much of the ancient tree by tree knowledge of our ancestors is now lost forever? Number 5, could you build a barn from mud and sticks? So when we think of a medieval building, we might picture a stone castle, but the vast majority of structures, from peasant cottages to farm barns, were not made of stone. They were made from the most basic, locally available materials: wood, mud, and straw. The primary building technique was called wattle and daub. It's a method so old it dates back to the Neolithic period, but it was perfected in the Middle Ages. And it was a remarkably sophisticated and sustainable way to build. First, you needed a timber frame. This was the skeleton of the building, made from green, unseasoned wood, often oak. The joints were not held together with nails, which were expensive, but with carefully carved mortise and tenon joints held in place with wooden pegs. This created a strong but flexible frame. Between these main timbers, the builder would weave a lattice of thin, flexible branches, usually hazel or willow. This woven panel was the wattle. It looked like a giant, sturdy basket. Next came the daub. This was the mud part of the equation. It was a sticky mixture of clay, soil, sand, water, and a binding agent like straw or animal dung. This concoction was then daubed or smeared all over both sides of the wattle panel, pushed into all the gaps until it formed a solid wall. When it dried, it was incredibly hard and durable. The final step was to give the exterior a coat of lime wash, a mixture of lime and water. This acted as a kind of primitive paint, protecting the daub from the rain and giving the building its characteristic white appearance. Why was this system so good? It was cheap. All the materials could be sourced locally, often from the farm itself. The wood for the frame and wattle came from the managed coppice woodlands. The clay came from the ground. The straw came from the fields. The only thing that might need to be purchased was the lime for the lime wash. It was also a very forgiving building method. It didn't require the precision of a master stonemason. A farmer with basic skills could build their own shelter. The resulting buildings were also surprisingly comfortable. The thick daub walls provided excellent thermal mass. They would absorb heat from the sun during the day and slowly release it at night, helping to regulate the temperature inside. The materials were also breathable. Unlike a modern wall sealed with a plastic vapor barrier, a wattle and daub wall allowed moisture to pass through it, which helped to prevent problems with condensation and mold. This is a principle that modern natural building advocates are rediscovering. The decline of wattle and daub came with the rise of new technologies and a desire for permanence. Brick making became more common and affordable. Stone became easier to quarry and transport. These new materials were seen as more durable and prestigious. The old mud and stick buildings were seen as primitive and old-fashioned. Many were torn down and replaced, and the skills needed to build and repair them began to fade. But the legacy of this technique surrounds us. In old towns across Europe, you can still see timber-framed buildings where the original wattle and daub panels are intact. And it raises some interesting questions for our modern age of construction, which relies on high-energy materials like concrete and steel. Could we learn from wattle and daub to create cheaper, more sustainable, and healthier homes using local, natural materials? By sealing our buildings in plastic and making them airtight, have we created unhealthy indoor environments that the breathable medieval houses avoided? And what other simple, effective building techniques have we dismissed as primitive in our relentless pursuit of technological novelty? Number 4, how did they select the best animals without genetics? A modern livestock breeder has a whole arsenal of scientific tools. They can look at an animal's DNA to check for desirable genes. They have estimated breeding values, EBVs, that predict an animal's potential for growth, milk production, or fertility. It's a data-driven process. The medieval farmer had none of this. They couldn't send a hair sample to a lab. and yet they were incredibly successful breeders. They developed the foundation stock for almost all of our modern breeds of cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses. How did they do it with nothing more than their own eyes and hands? Their method was based on a skill that is now incredibly rare: stockmanship. It was the art and science of observation. A good medieval stockman had an eye for an animal. They could look at a young bull or a ram and see its potential. They weren't just guessing, they were looking for a whole suite of subtle clues. They were masters of judging an animal's conformation, its physical structure. They knew that the width between the hip bones on a heifer was related to how easily she would be able to give birth. They knew that the depth of a bull's chest was related to its lung capacity and stamina. They looked for straight legs, a strong back, and a good temperament. These were all practical, physical traits that were directly linked to the animal's ability to survive, thrive, and work in their specific environment. This was a localized science. The ideal animal in the wet, hilly terrain of Wales was very different from the ideal animal in the flat, fertile plains of the Midlands. Breeders selected animals that were perfectly adapted to their local conditions. This is why so many historic breeds are named after the county or region where they were developed, like the Hereford cow or the Suffolk sheep. They were selecting for resilience and suitability, not just for maximum production. A cow that gave a huge amount of milk but couldn't survive the winter on rough grazing was useless. A sheep with incredibly fine wool that was susceptible to foot rot was a liability. They were breeding for a balanced, functional animal. The proof of their skill is in the results. Robert Bakewell, an 18th century farmer, is often called the father of modern animal breeding. But he wasn't working in a vacuum. He was building on centuries of accumulated knowledge from these anonymous medieval stockmen. He simply systematized the process of breeding the best to the best. He was famous for developing the Leicester Longwool sheep, a breed that grew quickly and produced both good wool and good meat. But he did it all through careful selection and record keeping, not through genetic analysis. The 20th century saw a dramatic shift in breeding goals. With the rise of industrial agriculture, the focus narrowed to a very small number of traits, primarily yield. We started breeding dairy cows that produced astonishing quantities of milk, but often had short lifespans and fertility problems. We bred pigs and chickens that grew incredibly fast, but had to be kept in climate-controlled buildings and fed a specialized diet. We traded the resilience and functionality of the old breeds for the raw productivity of the new ones. In the process, the old skill of visual assessment, of seeing the whole animal, was devalued and largely lost. It was replaced by reading numbers on a spreadsheet. This raises some challenging questions. In our data-driven pursuit of ever higher yields, have we bred animals that are so specialized they are now dangerously fragile? What unmeasured traits like disease resistance, mothering ability, or the ability to thrive on poor forage have we lost by focusing only on what is easy to quantify? And could a revival of the old art of stockmanship, of truly seeing and understanding the whole animal, be the key to breeding a more resilient and sustainable livestock population for the future? Number 3, did bees live in wicker baskets? The modern beehive is a neat, square box. It has removable frames, a design perfected by L.L. Langstroth in 1851. It allows the beekeeper to easily inspect the colony and harvest honey without destroying the hive. It's a system based on control and efficiency. For thousands of years before this, beekeeping was a very different art. And for much of the medieval period, the home of the honeybee was not a wooden box, but a woven basket called a skep. A skep was a simple dome-shaped basket, usually woven from straw, wicker, or coiled grasses. It was turned upside down, and a small entrance hole was made near the bottom. The inside was often coated with a mixture of cow dung and ash to make it smooth and weatherproof. The bees would be introduced to the skep, and they would build their natural looping combs directly attached to the inside walls and ceiling of the dome. It was a dark enclosed, well-insulated space that closely mimicked a natural tree hollow, the bees' preferred home. Managing bees in a skep required a completely different set of skills from modern beekeeping. You couldn't just open the hive and pull out a frame to see what was going on. The beekeeper had to judge the health and strength of the colony by external signs, the number of bees flying, the amount of pollen coming in, and most importantly, the weight of the skep. A heavy skep in the autumn meant it was full of honey. This was a craft based on intuition and a deep connection with the bees' natural cycles. Harvesting the honey was a brutal affair. Because the combs were attached directly to the skep, they couldn't be removed without being destroyed. The most common method was to dam the bees. At the end of the season, the beekeeper would select their heaviest skeps for honey and their lightest skeps, which were unlikely to survive the winter anyway. They would then kill the colonies in these skeps, usually by placing them over a pit filled with burning sulfur. The bees would be suffocated, and the beekeeper could then cut out the honey-filled combs. A few of the strongest colonies would be left alive to survive the winter and produce swarms the following spring to repopulate the empty skeps. This seems incredibly destructive to us, and it was, but it was part of a system that was, in its own way, sustainable. It mimicked natural selection. Only the strongest, most productive, and most disease-resistant colonies were chosen to survive the winter. The practice of driving bees, a more humane method where the bees were forced out of one skep into an empty one, was also known but was more difficult. The Langstroth hive changed everything. It made beekeeping more productive and less destructive. The skep was quickly seen as a primitive relic and fell out of use almost everywhere. But we may have lost something important in the transition. Bees in a straw skep enjoyed much better insulation than bees in a thin-walled wooden box. The natural shape allowed them to form their winter cluster more efficiently. Some modern natural beekeepers argue that skeps, or hives that mimic their shape and thermal properties, are actually healthier for the bees. Furthermore, the annual culling of weaker colonies and the constant breeding from local survivor swarms meant that the medieval bee population was likely very hardy and well adapted to its local environment. This lost tradition makes us ask some critical questions about our modern practices. Has the modern beehive, designed for the convenience of the beekeeper, created a less healthy environment for the bees themselves? By preventing natural swarming and propping up weak colonies with sugar, water, and medication, have we inadvertently bred a more fragile, dependent population of honeybees? And could the brutal but effective selective pressures of the old skep system hold a clue to breeding bees that are resistant to the diseases and parasites that plague them today? Number 2, what did an animal do after it died? In the modern world, when a farm animal is slaughtered, we are primarily interested in its meat. The rest of it, the hide, the bones, the offal, the fat, is often considered a low-value byproduct. Much of it is rendered down industrially or simply discarded. In the medieval world, there was no such thing as a byproduct. Every single part of a slaughtered animal was a precious resource. The idea of waste was an unaffordable luxury. The forgotten art was not a single trick, but a holistic mindset, the complete and utter utilization of the entire carcass. Let's take a cow as an example. The meat, of course, was eaten. The prime cuts would be eaten fresh, while the rest would be salted, smoked, or dried to preserve it for the long winter. But that was just the beginning. The blood was collected and used to make black pudding or as a thickener for stews. The hide was carefully removed and taken to a tanner, who would turn it into leather for shoes, belts, harnesses, and buckets. This was a long, smelly process, but it was essential. Leather was a critical material. The fat, or tallow, was rendered down by melting it. This tallow had dozens of uses. It was the primary material for making candles to light the dark medieval nights. It was used to make soap, it was used to waterproof leather boots, and to grease the axles of carts. Not a drop was wasted. The bones were also incredibly valuable. Large bones could be carved into tools like needles, combs, and knife handles. They could be used to make the playing pieces for games like chess or dice. The rest of the bones were boiled for hours to extract every last bit of nutrition and gelatin, creating a rich broth that was the base for soups and stews. After that, they could be ground up to make bone meal, a valuable fertilizer for the garden. Even the smallest parts had a purpose. The horns were heated and shaped to make drinking cups, powder horns, or window panes. Thinly scraped horn is translucent. The sinews from along the backbone could be dried and processed to make incredibly strong thread for sewing or for bowstrings. The intestines were cleaned and used as casings for sausages, or, in the case of sheep intestines, processed into catgut for the strings of musical instruments. The hooves could be boiled down to make glue. The hair from the hide could be mixed with plaster to strengthen it. This level of resourcefulness was born of pure necessity. The farmer had invested a huge amount of time and resources into raising that animal. To waste any part of it would have been unthinkable. This mindset extended to every aspect of the farm. Old clothes were patched and repatched, then turned into rags, and finally used to make paper. Nothing was thrown away until it had been used in every conceivable way. This wasn't recycling, this was a pre-cycling, no-waste world. Why did this change? The Industrial Revolution brought mass production. It became cheaper to buy a new metal pot than to mend an old one. It became easier to buy a wax candle than to render your own tallow. Specialized industries took over the jobs that were once done on the farm. The tanner, the soap maker, the glue boiler they were all part of a new industrial chain. The farmer's job was simplified to just producing the raw animal. As a result, the holistic knowledge of how to use every part of the carcass was fragmented and lost. We became a society of consumers, not producers and processors. The loss of this mindset has profound implications. We live in a disposable culture, creating mountains of waste while simultaneously depleting our natural resources. The medieval farmer, who we often pity, had a far more sustainable and circular economy than we do. It makes you ask, what valuable raw materials are we currently throwing away in our food system simply because we've forgotten how to use them? Could a revival of this nose-to-tail philosophy be a powerful tool in creating a less wasteful and more resilient society? And what is the psychological cost of living in a world where we are so disconnected from the true origin and the full potential of the things we use every day? Number one was the soil a living thing. This is the most fundamental and most forgotten idea of all. It's not a single trick or technique. It is the philosophical foundation upon which all the others were built. For the medieval farmer, the land was not an inert substance. It was not dirt. It was not a chemical medium to which you add inputs to get outputs. The soil was a living entity. It had its own rhythms, its own health, its own spirit. Their entire approach to farming was based on a relationship with this living soil. This worldview is hard for us to grasp. We are steeped in the language of chemistry and mechanics. We talk about pH levels, nitrogen content, and soil compaction. The medieval farmer used a different language. They spoke of the heart of the land. A field that was well farmed, with a good rotation of crops and regular manuring, was said to be in good heart. A field that was overexploited and exhausted was out of heart. This wasn't just a poetic metaphor. It reflected a deep understanding that the soil's fertility was a complex, living quality that had to be nurtured, not just managed. This belief manifested in their most important agricultural practice, the three-field system of crop rotation. A village's arable land would be divided into three large fields. In any given year, one field would be planted in the autumn with a winter crop like wheat or rye. The second field would be planted in the spring with a spring crop like barley, oats, or legumes, peas, and beans. The third field would be left fallow. It would be unplanted for the entire year. The next year, the fields would rotate. The fallow field would get the winter crop field would get the spring crop, and the spring crop field would be left fallow. To a modern, efficiency-obsessed mind, leaving a third of your land unproductive every year seems insane. It seems like a massive waste. But the fallow period was the key to the entire system's sustainability. It was the year the land was allowed to rest and recover. It was the year it was allowed to heal. During the fallow year, the field would be plowed several times to control weeds. And most importantly, it was used for grazing the village's livestock. The animals would graze the weeds and stubble, and in return they would deposit their manure, directly infusing the soil with fertility and organic matter. They were putting the heart back into the land. The inclusion of legumes like peas and beans in the rotation was also a stroke of genius. The medieval farmer didn't know about nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the root nodules of legumes. But they knew from observation that planting a field with beans one year made the wheat crop in the following year much better. They were practicing a sophisticated science without the scientific vocabulary. They were working with the living systems of the soil because they saw the soil itself as alive. This entire worldview was swept away by the scientific and agricultural revolutions. The work of chemists like Justus von Liebig in the 19th century reduced the complex biology of the soil to a simple chemical equation. Fertility was no longer about heart, it was about the presence of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The fallow year was replaced by the cultivation of new fodder crops or eventually by the application of chemical fertilizers. The living system was replaced by an industrial process. The relationship was replaced by an equation. And now we are seeing the consequences. Our soils are becoming depleted of organic matter. They are losing their structure, leading to erosion and desertification. They are losing their biodiversity, the vast and complex web of microbes and fungi that are the true source of soil health. We are realizing that the old farmers, with their talk of the heart of the land, may have understood something more profound about the nature of soil than our chemical analyses have revealed. This leaves us with the most shocking questions of all. What if the soil really is a single complex living organism, and by treating it like a factory floor, we have been slowly killing it? Have we, in our cleverness, forgotten the single most important rule of all agriculture, that we are not masters of the land, but partners with it? And is it possible to ever build a truly sustainable future for humanity until we learn to see the ground beneath our feet not as dirt, but as the living foundation of our very existence?